Welcome back to the Eastern Front, guys. Now we're going to look more at the end of the war, the results of the conflict in the Eastern Front, and of course the Russian Revolution. I mentioned that a lot of empires are going to collapse, so we'll start with Russia. So what happens here? Russia's going to have a revolution, which seems odd because we last left off at the Provisional Offensive when the Russians had blasted through and Austria-Hungary's armies had collapsed, and the Germans were having to prop them up against Italian attack and Russian attack and having to draw their forces away, and the Russians had had this massive victory. But the victory, again, cost 1 million casualties, which you add the 2 million casualties of Gorlice-Tarnow and the casualties of 1914, and Russia has lost millions of men on the battlefield. But more importantly, well, related to that, is there's a lot of domestic trouble in Russia, and that's the revolution. So first, in 1905, there's a revolution, and this is important to note. In 1905, after their defeat in the, well, actually in the middle of their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, one reason they get defeated is they kind of have to deal with a revolution and can't focus on Japan. But in 1905, they have a revolution. There's massive popular unrest. People are out on the streets protesting, and the Tsar, Nicholas II, has to give up some of his powers and organize a Duma, which is sort of a Congress for the Russians. And he doesn't like that. He winds up rolling back a lot of those things after he gets his army back from the Russo-Japanese War, and it's kind of like, stabby, 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 shoot you. But there is a revolution then, and he puts it down. He controls it. So this isn't the beginning. This has been simmering for years. Russians are tired of being ruled by the autocratic czars, the Romanov family that has ruled them for about 300 years. And Russia is very backwards. Russians are still largely peasant serfs, basically living in a virtually feudal medieval society where the emperor is totally in charge and the peasants have no rule, and there's less education, and they're just living very simple lives. Other European citizens are much more educated, they're much more involved, more modern lifestyles by this time, but Russia is practically still feudal medieval. They're past it, but they've been changing a whole lot slower, and that's something to be important. We looked at the kind of collapse of China and talked about how Japan modernized very quickly and avoided that. China has this very slow path to modernity where they miss the boat for about 100 years, and then they blast their way there in the 1950s to 80s. And now are powerful again. Russia kind of does the same thing where they're slow getting on to these trends like industrialization and modernization. And because of that, World War I is a disaster for them because they are really having to catch up in every way in the middle of the war instead of being prepared for it. So there's a 1905 revolution. It fails. There's a 1917 February revolution. So after the success of the Brusilov offensive, there are still millions of Russian troops on the front, and Russian troops are still dying, and millions of Russian troops are dying or being wounded. And the Tsar has a problem because he's having trouble feeding his people. There are internal issues. All this food, all this resources is going to the front to prop up the army, and because of that, people are starving. And the Tsar and his wife are unable to deal with internal problems based on Russia's food system, based on limitations there. As people are going into factory jobs to replace all the men who are dying at the front, they then aren't making food. People in the cities are taking all the food from the country, and people in the country want the food. And there's internal divisions, and the Tsar does a very poor job of dealing with them. This is eerily similar to the French Revolution, when the people were hungry and the autocratic ruler couldn't just give them food, and instead spent money on costly wars. Had Nicholas II ended the war, signed an armistice with Germany, he probably could have dealt with it. And he might have ruled for who knows how much longer. He could have fed his people, pulled his army out of the war. The Allies would have suffered. That would have been disastrous for them, and France and Britain would not have been happy with him, but they would have been very unlikely to actually go to war with him over it. And he probably could have solved the problem. So he doesn't. In 1917, he's relying on the army, and the army collapses, and the units that are there to protect him, the Petrograd garrison, the St. Petersburg garrison, rebels with the people. They're being ordered to put down the protesters, but the only way to do that is to have the army kill protesters, in autocratic Russia anyway. And some of them do, and a lot of them go, I'm not going to shoot our own people. I refuse. And so the garrison refuses the Tsar's orders to put down the protests and instead largely joins the protesters. The police and other divisions either have to join them or die. There's fighting in the streets of the capital of St. Petersburg, and the Tsar goes off into retreat nearer to the army, thinking that he can grab the army and bring them back to take out the people. The army is not interested in fighting. They're not interested in fighting the Germans anymore because they're sick of dying. They're not interested in fighting the Russian people because they're their own people. And the Tsar doesn't realize that he's really lost complete control of his country. His insistence on prosecuting the war, even despite the successes of the Brusilov offensive, basically kills his army and kills all the loyalty. All the troops that were loyal to him are dead. They went off, they fought the war, the Germans machine gunned them to death, and then they got replaced with troops that are new cadets, that are fresh, that are from these areas, that are more loyal to their local people than they are to the Tsar. And this is going to be kind of I mentioned this with the Austrian army, where the most loyal troops all die in the early parts of the war. The Russians have the same problem. All the loyal troops, all the long-standing troops, all the ones who've grown up in this sort of tradition of honor and glory and defense of the emperor, they're dead. They all got killed at Tannenberg and Gorlice-Tarnow and the Brusilov offensive. The Germans murdered them. And when the Germans murdered them, they're unable to replace them with good, loyal troops. These new troops feel underfed, underappreciated. They feel like they're just being thrown to their deaths fighting the Germans for nothing. And so there's another revolution. The government gets established, the Provisional Government, and the Provisional Government, of course, does the smart thing and ends the war with the Germans, right? 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 No. No. This guy named Alexander Kerensky is put in charge, and he's a socialist, and he's not a communist, and he's not a Bolshevik, but he says we have to maintain our alliances with our allies. We can't just abandon those. In fact, here's his quote and his face, in case you want it. Let's zoom in on the face. Look at that guy. Looks pretty ferocious. For the sake of the nation's life, it was necessary to restore the army's will to die. Die? I would have thought it might say fight, to win, to achieve victory. No, to die. He knows the army's going to die. The army is refusing to fight. They're basically going, no, we're not attacking. Charge! No, I don't think I will. I think I'll sit here in the trench and drink some tea. If the Germans come up, I'll shoot back at them a little bit. And so he's dealing with this mutiny where the army is unwilling to die, which is kind of logical. Remember what I talked about, the stupidity of warfare and all this time. Kerensky realizes this, and he thinks that it's necessary to keep dying. We've got to throw our men into the meat grinder and protect the Allies and fight the Germans, because otherwise we'll renege on our international agreements. This is stupid. There was just a revolution in the country. The fact that he doesn't grasp that the revolution was because the people want food and want an end to the war is his great mistake. If he'd realized that, if he'd signed an armistice, if he'd ended the war, particularly in 1916 after the Brusilov offensive, or early 1917 before the major German offensives reopen up, he probably could have found decent terms, because the Germans would have been like, sure, whatever, Russia, go away. We want to fight in the Eastern Front. We want to send our army over here. They probably would have given him fairly reasonable terms just to get Russia out of the war, so they could focus on a one-front war. But Kerensky doesn't do that. Instead, he wants to, revive their will to die. And what he does, he launches what winds up being called the Kerensky Offensive, the June Offensive, in 1917. And all he really does is he gets hundreds of thousands more of his soldiers killed. And the Russian army goes, no, we're done. We're done. Because they attack, they take some stuff, and they lose some stuff, and German machine guns are waiting. And those machine guns kill the Russian Empire, really. The last loyal soldiers die. The remainder mutiny and rebel. The army goes in, and so in 1917, in October, just about 6 months later, there is a second revolution. Sorry, that's 8 months later. In October, this time it is Lenin in charge. He has gotten back. He's in Petrograd, in the square, making dramatic speeches, and he says, I have some promises for you, Russians. I will make sure everyone has bread, and I will redistribute the land to the peasants, not to the rich landowners, and I will end the war. Land, bread, no war. Very simple platform. Super effective. That is what the Russians wanted. If Kerensky had done that, there probably would not have been a Soviet Union, at least very much not likely, and perhaps millions of lives would have been spared in later famines and wars. But the people latch onto this. My own land to farm, food to feed my children, not going and dying or sending my son to die in the war. That's what I want. And so Lenin takes over. In this second revolution, the Soviet Union is born. Tsar Nicholas II is executed fairly early on because, again, Tsar Nicholas II is the cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II. He is the cousin of King George V. There's a fear among the Russians that Nicholas II will band with loyalist troops of the armies and other powers and take out the Bolshevik revolution. He would have loved to do that, kind of like how King Louis in France gets killed, again, because he appeals to his relatives in the other European countries, and that scares the rebels. So later in the year, the Tsar is executed along with his entire family, which brings us to the glorious myths and music of the story of Anastasia, both in the Disney version and the stage show. This great myth that the youngest daughter survived and wasn't killed and escaped, and could then theoretically come back to restore the Romanov monarchy. Didn't happen. His whole family and him, as well as his young son, are all murdered by the Bolsheviks, extinguishing the Romanov line and Tsarist rule in Russia and the Russian Empire, as it were, and establishing the Soviet Union. One of Lenin's first moves is to begin negotiating a peace with the Germans. As he does that, the Germans push for more and more. They want to control most of the stuff. They want to take stuff. Lenin doesn't like that. He's trying to stall for time. He thinks a Soviet revolution is going to happen in Germany and everywhere else. He thinks his revolution is going to spread throughout the entire world. He's wrong. There are revolutions. There are attempts. There are workers who protest and strike and do things, but they are put down in Germany. They are put down in the other countries. There is no massive world revolution. And the Germans go, okay, you're stalling for time, we're taking more. And they just start invading Russia and taking more and more because there is no Russian army at this point. The army has disbanded and gone home. Lenin has internal problems. And so after a couple of months of, ooh, this is getting worse, he finally signs the treaty and kind of bails on it. Now, this has risks in its own because once he signs the treaty, then the Allied powers no longer see him as an ally. The French and the British suddenly are very suspicious now. They don't like this regime. They're not really interested in overthrowing it, but now they're like, well, you're useless, so we want someone to fight the Germans. And they're going to start supporting groups. There's going to be a bunch of Czechoslovakian troops that were in Russia that were captured from the Austro-Hungarian army, and the Allies will try to get them out to come bring them around to fight the Germans, and they'll take over the railroad. And there's a massive civil war in Russia that happens over the next couple of years where the remnants of loyalist troops and minorities in Russia will try to put together armies to fight the Bolsheviks, and they will fail. They probably wouldn't have failed if the Germans had cared, because the Germans could have easily marched to St. Petersburg and taken out the Soviet government. But they wanted all their troops on the Western Front. They didn't like this whole communist thing, but as long as the Russians were willing to sue for peace, even though they easily could have taken the capital and knocked out the power of the Russian regime and had tied up the one fighting force the Soviets had trying to defend their capital, they accept the peace and they go to fight in the Western Front, and the Soviets will take over. So here's some quotes about this. Nice people. So Maxim Gorky said, I am especially distrustful of a Russian when he gets power into his hands. Not long ago a slave, he becomes the most unbridled despot as soon as he has the chance to become his neighbor's master. Basically saying Russians were slaves yesterday, and as soon as you give them power, they're going to become dictators. They're going to not use it. They're going to absolutely dominate their neighbors. Nikolai Krylenko, the Commissar for Justice, said this, we must execute not only the guilty, execution of the innocent will impress the masses even more. Oh, nice guy. Commissar for Justice. If we just execute guilty people, guys, that's not going to do anything. We've got to kill innocent people, too. That will impress the masses. Ooh, that is not justice. That is terror. And this is going to become called the Red Terror because the Soviets will start murdering all sorts of people to try and make sure nobody is willing to fight back and to try and suppress resistance before it happens by murdering even the innocent and not just the guilty in order to intimidate the loyal Russians remaining. And finally, from Leon Trotsky, who is going to be the commander of the Red Army during the Civil War, is going to fight for power. He'll wind up losing to Stalin. After Lenin dies, Trotsky and Stalin fight out to see who will become the next ruler. He's a terrible and terrifying individual. If we have a chance, maybe I'll talk about him more later. But he said this: "We must put to an end once and for all the papist Quaker babble about the sanctity of life." Oh yes. Let's get rid of all that religious nonsense about the sanctity of life. I mean, why does life matter? We're Russians, after. These are terrible people to be running your country. These are terrible people to be taking over our government. People that say we need to kill the innocent along with the guilty. People that say we need to get rid of this crazy Judeo-Christian idea that life matters. Oh, life matters. Life is sacred. That's what the Bible teaches. And Russia had been a center of the Orthodox Russian Church, the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And many of the Russians were Christians who did believe in the sanctity of life. They were horrified when their leaders sent people to die. And so, again, they were horrified, a lot of people, about killing the innocent. And Trotsky is going to grind that out of them as he commences this Red Terror and as he goes around oppressing anyone who challenges the Red regime. And the Soviet regime that rises up is just that. It is willing to murder the innocent and the guilty, whatever it takes to establish order and control and to force the people to follow their policies no matter what. They take away their freedoms, and they do it in a brutal fashion and reorganize Russian society. In the end, they will produce industrialization and growth, and Russia will become a major player again in the next World War, before the Soviet Union eventually collapses because the system is inferior to the capitalist system of the West. But these are brutal people who are going to take power brutally at the end of a brutal war. Already millions of Russians have died, and millions more are going to die in this civil war as all parts of Russia start fighting each other with a lack of organized troops, and the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, enact a campaign of terror to put down all resistance over the next couple of years. The Eastern Front. Victory and defeat and the collapse of the Russian Empire. There you have it. If you have any questions, bring them to me in our next class, and I'll go over an overview of the total aftermath of the war in my next video as we get to the treaties in the end and see how it all shook out. All right, see you guys later.